then please enter it into the chat window, and we'll try to pick up as many questions as we can at the end. So agenda today is, I'll just do a few introductions of myself and Geeta, who will be talking to you today. And then we're just going to have a quick look through the general conditions that all operators operate under, but not all operators know about. So it's just worth recapping on those. Then we'll have a quick look at the UK Electronic Communications Code. Geeta's then going to talk through a little bit about the Ofcom market review and the potential impacts that has on various operators. And then we'll just have a quick overview of some other DCMS initiatives that are going on. And then at the end, I'll just talk a little bit about the INCA Regulatory and Policy SIG, the Special Interest Group. And then hopefully we'll have time at the end for your questions. There's quite a lot to get through. So what we'll do is Geeta and I will just talk through the slides we've got, giving you the overview, probably for the first hour or so. And then hopefully we'll have time to, as I say, pick up any questions at the end. Good. All right. So moving forward, the general conditions. So if you run a telephone company or telephone network, or even provide communication services in this country, it used to be before 2003 that you needed a license to do that. But the Telecommunications Act in 2003 did away with a licensing regime. And in effect, anyone can now run a telephone network or offer telecommunication services in the UK, but they have to abide by a certain number of what's called general conditions. And these are broken down into three key sections. There's one section which is just around how your network should function, section A. There's section B, which talks about how you should deal with telephone numbering primarily, but some other technical conditions in there. And then part C deals with consumer protection conditions. And to be fair, I think it's safe to say it's the consumer protection section that Ofcom tends to get most agitated by if people fail to comply with those. The other ones, most people tend to sort of comply with by default. But I'm just going to go through some of the details behind each of those conditions and just talk you through, because certainly when we started up as a telco in 2013, it was only, you know, a little time after operating that we even appreciated these general conditions existed. And I suspect there may be other smaller operators out there that are not fully aware of them. So I'm just going to run through some of them today. What you can see just on the headlines at the bottom there is if you fail to comply with these general conditions, then Ofcom our regulator have quite a lot of powers to dish out some pretty meaty fines if you're failing to meet these general conditions and customers start to complain. In fact, in some of these cases, it doesn't even take a customer complaint. The operator themselves did what was right and reported themselves to the regulator to say they think they'd failed to meet a condition, but nevertheless, the regulator still dished out some quite meaty fines. So it is worth knowing what these are and making sure you are compliant with them. So just in section A, just looking through those, there's 5 conditions in section A. The first one is a general condition that you should that provides interconnect obligations. Now this was written mainly in the days of telephone systems, and it basically says that if you run it used to say if you ran a telephone network, then you and another telephone operator came and approached you and said, we want to interconnect our networks so that telephone calls can pass between us, then there was an obligation on operators to negotiate that interconnection agreement. But the way that obligation is worded actually means that that obligation to interconnect still exists between all operators, whether you're providing telephone services, in fact, or internet services. So that condition still exists. It seems, I questioned Ofcom on it a few weeks ago. It seems they don't really apply it to broadband networks, but it's worth being aware that it's out there, because ultimately it could mean that if you're running a broadband network and another broadband operator, a code operator, comes and asks you for an interconnect agreement, under this condition, you are still obliged to negotiate that interconnect agreement and look to interconnect your two networks. So not often used, but worth knowing that it's there just in case another operator tries to potentially use it against you. The section 2, and you can look these up and in the slides that I circulate at the end, so we'll circulate these slides. I'll also add onto them some of the links where you can go to find out more information on each of these. But on the second condition basically says the apparatus you use needs to comply with the European standards and international standards and specifications, primarily so that it can be interconnected with other operators as you use it. So there's a condition there that the apparatus you use must comply with various standards. The condition number 3, A3, talks about how you have an obligation to keep your services available at all times. And this is in particularly important so that your customers can access emergency services should they need to. So this is one that Ofcom does spend a little bit of time on, and you need to be able to demonstrate that you can repair your network and put it back into a functioning order, even in the event of a catastrophic network failure, as they call it. So you have to have provisions in place to be able to provide your end users with access to emergency services. Again, was written in the days of telecommunications and voice lines, but it still applies today to broadband users and VoIP services. And there's some specific conditions in there for VoIP services, which if those are the types of services you're providing, worth having a look at that condition just to make sure that you are compliant with some of those provisions. Condition 4 was around emergency planning. In terms of emergency planning, this is largely around if there is a national issue. Again, you as an operator, you have to sort of follow the instructions of the authorities. So if the government or local authorities even instruct you to do something in particular with your network or do something to rapidly restore your network, then again, there are certain conditions on you as a telephone operator to meet those requirements and follow their instructions. And then condition 5, not really applicable to broadband or telecommunications providers, but it's the provisions that insist that certain television and video providers must carry various different types of programming. So not so applicable to us at the moment, but if you get into video services, again, something to be aware of. So those are the network function conditions. That's part A. Part B of these general conditions is mainly around telephone numbering, and the first condition explains how you are allowed, or what telephone numbers are allocated to you, or how you get an allocation of telephone numbers, and what you're allowed and what you can and can't do with those telephone numbers. So again, if you're providing a telephone service, you should be aware of those. Condition 2 on this was around directory information. And if you, again, written in a day when everyone received a telephone directory through their door each year with a list of telephone numbers, but still applicable today to help drive sort of 118 directory services and indeed online directory services. So if you're running telephone services, you still have an obligation to provide your numbering information to other operators so that they can provide those directory services. That's something you have to do on a regular basis. Condition 3 in this section is all around number portability, and it provides a requirement that you must port telephone numbers. If a customer requests that you port telephone numbers between operators, then you must enable that and must allow the customer to port their number. Now, again, I think it's something that smaller operators don't always do. They don't necessarily have all the agreements in place to be able to port numbers, but potentially if a customer complains to Ofcom that they can't port their number from one network to another, then in theory you're in breach of this condition, and in fact in practice you're in breach of this condition, and you could be fined for it. So again, worth looking, if you're doing voice services, worth looking at that section. And section 4 here is around access to numbers and services. It says that as an operator, you're not allowed to arbitrarily block access to any particular number, but it carves out a provision there that Ofcom can define numbers that should be blocked. So if they're having problems of fraud or misuse of premium rate numbers, then Ofcom can send out a message that those numbers should be blocked, and as an operator you would need to comply with that. So that's section A and section B of the general conditions that we all have to operate under. Moving on to section C, as I said at the start, this is the one that Ofcom really pays attention to. It's about consumer protection. I think we see increasingly Ofcom sees its role as the protector of the consumer, perhaps over and above of any of its other duties. And so these conditions are becoming increasingly important. And if you fall foul of these, this is probably where it's most likely you could end up getting a big fine. So just on contract requirements is condition 1. So there are a number of detailed provisions in there of what you must include within your customer terms and conditions, and things like for residential services, your contracts can't be any more than 24 months, and provisions like that. These are things that obviously your legal advisors should be aware of, but again, as an operator, it's worth considering these yourselves to understand what it is you can't do in a customer what it is you can do in a customer contract, and what it is you can't do in a customer contract. And so they're over and above for the telecoms industry what you might see in standard law. So it's important that when you're taking legal advice, that the person who's providing that advice does understand these general conditions. Part 2, information publication and transparency requirements. So this is about the information you have to provide to consumers, both before they sign up to a contract and during the life of that contract. And it's all about transparency of the information and not being confusing for customers in terms of pricing policies and charges, and indeed being able to provide specific information about what you might charge for calls to premium rate numbers, non-geographic numbers, so on and so forth. So again, some quite specific rules there about what information you must provide to consumers about the services they're receiving and what they'll be paying for. And also linked then to section 3, which is the billing requirements, which basically provides an overall obligation that you mustn't overcharge customers based on those prices that you would have told them about in section 2. And they also the consumer needs to be able to adequately control how much they spend on services. And again, there's details of how that's applied within the details of the conditions. And an interesting aspect of that is it provides an obligation on operators to treat consumers fairly where they have not paid their bills. And again, further details of exactly what that means are contained in the guidance notes to that condition. And then section 4 of the consumer protection part talks about how you should handle consumer complaints and the dispute resolution. Now, I hope you're all aware that you have to be a member of one of the 2 authorised alternative dispute resolution bodies. So there's 2 of them that have been enabled or authorised by Ofcom. One is the Ombudsman Service, which Community Fibre is a member of, and the other one is CICAS, I believe, and you can choose which one you're a member of, but you must be a member of one of those if you're running a telephone or a electronic communication network in the UK. So if you're not a member of one of those at the moment, I suggest you do become one very soon, and you have to include details of who you are a member of, both in your terms and conditions, but also clearly on your website, either on your front page or one click away from your front page, is what those conditions say. And you also have to have details of your complaints procedure in the same place. And that's how specific some of these conditions are. So again, important that you do read through the detail, which I won't be able to go into today in the hour that we've got. But as I say, I'll put the link to accompany the slides so you can read through those at your leisure. There are 4 other of the consumer protection issues, and I've realised the one at the bottom should be C8, not C4, but apologies for that on my slides. Condition 5 under consumer protection is that you must meet the needs of vulnerable customers and end users with disabilities. Largely, this talks about being able to provide large print and braille versions of your communications for people with poor sight. And it also talks about providing uninterrupted power supplies for various bits of equipment. So in the event of the power cut, certainly what is classed vulnerable people can still connect to emergency services. Now, there is a lot of debate. It's one of the debates going on in industry at the moment as to what precisely is a vulnerable customer and which bits of apparatus in a sort of all IP world need to be backed up by a power supply. That is an ongoing debate between industry and Ofcom at the moment, and is the sort of things that gets discussed at the INCA Special Interest Group. And depending on the type of network you run, especially in an all IP world, there's a lot of questions as to whether, for example, the ONT and the router all need uninterrupted power supplies. So that's one to watch out for, some of the work that's ongoing at the moment. Condition 6 is about calling line identification, and says that if you're running a telephone service, you must provide your end users with calling line identification, and enable them to use that to reduce incidents of nuisance calls, and ensure that's properly presented. So that's for telephone service operators. Condition 7 is about switching, and says that you must make it reasonably simple for your end customers to switch their service from one operator to another. There is a lot of work going on that at the moment, which I'll come on to in a moment. Some of you I know have been involved. And condition 8 is the sales and marketing for mobile communication. So there's some specific conditions for mobile communications and what they have to say in their sales and marketing literature. Geeta's quite rightly pointed out, which I've touched on as I've been through, that different conditions apply to different providers depending on what services that you provide. So you can see that some of those conditions pretty much apply exclusively to those that are providing telephone services, whereas some of them apply more broadly, irrespective of what type of service you provide. And those details are all held in the guidance that I'll send you a link to. But I just wanted to set an overview because some people may not know that in providing telephone services across the UK, we all have to comply with those various conditions. And one of the things that's happening at the moment is those conditions are going to be or are going through significant change. And this is partly because of the European Electronic Communications Code that is being or needs to be implemented within the UK by the 21st of December this year, which of course is still in the transition period. So there has been a lot of talk about it being implemented by the 21st of December. I think there's still some questions whether we can actually achieve that in this sort of COVID period. But I sense that even if we don't achieve it and we're sort of outside of Europe by the time some of this stuff gets implemented, I think certainly the messages we get from DCMS, the government department, is that they're going to continue and implement these anyway, whether we're inside Europe or outside Europe, because they all seem like reasonably good ideas type thing. So there's some debate as to whether we'll get through all of the consultations and legislation on these by the 21st of December, but I don't think that means that they're going to go away. And the one you've probably heard most about, as I say, because it comes up in a number of INCA discussions, is the switching and the porting. So this is enhancing the switching condition that I already spoke about to make it what's called gainer provider led switching. So that effectively should mean that the gaining provider, the provider, the operator that's winning the customer, should be able to switch the customer onto their network and switch them off the losing provider's network without the customer having to contact the losing provider. Now, Ofcom has asked industry to say, how can we do this and what's the solution to enable this gaining provider-led switching? Industry has gone back to Ofcom with two options because industry couldn't agree on a single option itself. Ofcom, there's an ongoing debate, but Ofcom have now come back to industry and said, no, here's some clarification, please come up with the one solution as an industry. But we're running out of time on this, and if we don't come up with a solution soon, Ofcom are probably just going to impose one that we will all have to comply with. So there's a lot of discussion going on that at the moment. On point 2, there's going to be some changes to what you can do in terms of contract duration, and specifically how you terminate contracts and information you need to provide to customers at the end of contracts. These provisions have actually come in already. Ofcom decided to implement these early and have already made the changes to the general conditions on this. So they have to, so you hopefully already know that when your contracts now end, a month before that, you have to send your customers a notification to say that their contract is ending and what is the best tariff that your customer can move on to. And you also have to send, if once they're out of contract, you have to send them a notification every year to say what's the best tariff they can now get from you. Those came into force in February. You should be sending those notices out to your customers now. If you're Ofcom has said actually during the COVID period that they're not going to enforce them and are going to give operators a little bit more time to get them in place. But if you don't have systems in place that are sending your customers those notifications now, then I'd suggest you do get those in place very quickly, because once COVID is over, then Ofcom have said they'll be enforcing that. And again, you open yourself up to some considerable fines if you're not doing that. The third sort of key part of the ECC is the provision of information to customers about their services. And so this area is all about, I'm just trying to remember what this one is about. It's about how much information you need to provide to customers about their service. I'm going to come back to, I can't remember, Geeta, if you can remember anything specific on that one, but we'll come back.
Not specifically right now, no.
No, I've just got a mind blank on that one, but there are some specifics around new types of information. I think the key point is they're going to change some of the information that you have to provide to customers in the contract. I remember now, the contract summary. You're going to have on the front of all your terms and conditions a summary of the key contract provisions. And so that's the key part of it, but it also changes some of the protections for consumers in your terms and conditions. And I think, so what effectively the effect of that is you're all going to have to change the terms and conditions that you currently use with your customers. So it's worth being aware of that and starting work on that possibly early. And then number 4 is publication of information and provision to third parties. What that is about is Ofcom is going to be obliged to have a sort of a nominated or a approved price comparison website across the industry. So there's going to be a new approved Ofcom price comparison website or websites, and we will all have an obligation to provide pricing and contract information to that third party provider, and all the provisions of that come under the code as well. 5 and 6 are around disincentives to switch and removing disincentives to switch for consumers. Number 5 is about mobile devices and not allowing mobile providers any longer to lock their devices to their service contract. And number 6 is about bundled packages. And if you've got a bundle of TV services, broadband services, and voice services, you're going to have those all terminating on the same date. So you won't be able to have different termination dates for those different bundled packages. And that's what number 6 introduces. Number 7, there will be an expanded provisions around disabled customers. So as I said before, the current conditions mainly deal with customers with poor sight. Number 7 completely broadens that out to anybody with a disability. You as an operator will need to take account of that disability and provide your communications and literature to them in a form that is appropriate for their disability, that they can use irrespective of their disability. And then finally, number 8 is about, again, some additional provisions, and this is where the non-interrupted power supply comes in, availability of service and access to emergency services. And a key part of that also is all operators will have to provide free access for deaf customers to a British Sign Language video service. And so you will have to have an agreement with a sign language video service, whereas if you have a deaf customer, they will need to be given free access to that service so that they can use your services and communicate both with your own customer service team, but obviously with other people that they want to communicate with. So there is the reason for that slide is there is a lot of change going on to the general conditions. They will definitely have an impact on the terms and conditions you have with your customer, and you need to be aware of them and working on them now because they're going to be coming in place later in the year. I'm quickly going to go through the Electronic Communications Code very briefly. This is a piece of legislation that you might all be aware of, but it gives us as operators the power to come and install our apparatus across your line. I'm going to quickly fly through this because I'm conscious of time, and I'm running a little bit behind. So I'm just going to go through the key points here. Part two of the Act explains, or the regulations, sorry, the code explains the rights that an operator has to effectively install its apparatus on any private or public land, and says that agreement you put in place with the landlord must be in writing, and must be signed, and also says it doesn't have to be registered with the land registry. Part 3 says that agreement that you put in place with the landlord must enable you to assign, upgrade and share your apparatus with other operators as well. And they can't really unreasonably constrain that ability to assign, upgrade and share the apparatus. There is part 4 talks about if you can't come to an agreement with the landlord, then it gives the court power to impose an agreement where an agreement can't be got to. Part 5 talks about how you might terminate an agreement, and effectively, unless you're sort of in breach of the agreement or something like that, the only way a landlord or the landlord must serve 18 months notice to an operator if they want to terminate one of these agreements once it's in place. There's some caveats around that, but that's the general principle of that part. Part 6 talks about how they can then get operators removed. So once they've served you the 18 months notice, there is then another 6 months notice that they have to provide you to actually get the apparatus removed. In general, landlords find this very onerous, and that's why they're often very resistant to put some of these way leaves in place. Part 7 to 13, I'm not going to detail those here. It deals with funny things like highways and tidal waters and overhead apparatus. If you're interested in those, please do have a look, but I'm not going to cover those here. Part 14 talks about how much a landlord should get in compensation for putting one of these way leaf agreements in place. And it pretty much says the only things a landlord should charge for is compensation for their direct costs associated with putting the way leaf in place, and consideration payment for any diminution of the value of the land that they may have on what's called a no scheme basis. So they can't take account of the fact that the apparatus is being used for telecommunication services. It must just be the value of the land that they're having to give up for this particular scheme. Part 15 just talks about notices that have to go between the landlord and the operator, and which ones of those need to be prescribed by Ofcom. And part 16 just really says it's the courts that deal with any disputes, and says in the case of England that it's the upper tribunal Land Chamber that deals with disputes of this bits of legislation. And then finally, part 17 is just some supplementary information. Another point here is that this is going to be updated, or possibly going to be updated very soon, by a bill that's currently going through Parliament, which is intended to give even more more power to operators where a landlord just fails to respond to a request for a way leaf agreement. Is that good or bad? Again, something that will probably be discussed in terms of the interest groups. At first sight, seems good because it gives operators more powers. For us, seems good for us. On the other hand, possibly bad because it's probably going to upset some landlords, and there's already quite a rift between landlords and operators, and potentially could this make it worse? So something we'll probably discuss at the special interest group in weeks to come. So that's a very quick whistle top tour of the general conditions, some of the changes that may be happening to the general conditions and the electronic communications code, and some of the changes to the electronic communications code. Geeta is now just going to take us through some of the changes that might be coming up as part of the market review by Ofcom.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I'll just motor on because we want to have as much time for questions afterwards as possible. I'm having a problem with my internet connection, so do let me know if you can't hear or see me. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the Ofcom market review that's currently ongoing. It's called the Wholesale Fixed Telecoms Market Review, or WFTMR. It rolls off the tongue. Basically, what Ofcom does is at regular intervals, it conducts market reviews to see whether there is effective competition, or if there is not effective competition, does anybody have what they call significant market power? If they have significant market power, or SMP, then they will impose regulatory conditions on them in order to try and prevent them from abusing that market power. And in the UK, we are seeing basically in the fixed market in particular that BT is being regulated, as is KCOM in Hull. The WFTMR is, for the first time, Ofcom is combining a number of different fixed telecoms markets together and reviewing them as one in order to try and create greater consistency across how those markets are regulated. Because there has been some confusion and some inconsistency between for example, how the leased lines market and the broadband market were regulated. And that basically meant that in the broadband market, there were incentives for people to invest in competitive networks, whereas in leased line markets, there were not. And we have spent a lot of time telling Ofcom that that doesn't work, because if you're building a fixed telecoms infrastructure, then you need access to both of those markets in order to make it viable. And therefore, having contradicting regulatory intervention is not a good idea. And they've listened and are now combining them all into one. And the stated objective of this WFTMR is to encourage investment in new fibre networks in as many parts of the UK as possible. It was launched in January this year. Responses were submitted in May. They were delayed from, I think, the 1st of April or the end of March because of COVID. The intention is that the review will be completed. Ofcom will have reviewed all the responses and made its decisions and published its decisions of new regulation to apply from the 1st of April next year. And that they will apply for 5 years. So previously they had applied for 3 years, but this is the first time we have a 5-year review. And the reason this is particularly important to INCA members is that Ofcom is still finding that BT/Openreach has SMP, so therefore they will be regulated. But they are saying they will differentiate the way they regulate BT depending on whether Ofcom thinks that it's likely that there will be material competition to Openreach in individual locations. And what they're basically saying is in some areas where we think there will be other people building networks competing with Openreach, we will regulate in one way, and in the places where we don't think there will, we'll regulate in another way. And the main concern we have, and INCA has had with this, is the regulation of the areas where Ofcom thinks there would not be enough competition. This is what's called Area 3. And if you look at this map, all the bits that are not green are Area 3. So it's a vast, vast majority of the country. And kind of with the exception of community fibre and a small number of others, a lot of INCA's members are actually active in exactly those areas. So how Ofcom regulates Openreach and BT in those areas is absolutely critical. So what Ofcom is suggesting is that in the green areas on the map, they will regulate in such a way that there are incentives for Openreach and Altnet to invest. So for example, they're going to set the Openreach prices, the regulated Openreach wholesale prices, in such a way that prices don't get driven down too quickly and too aggressively, so that it remains viable to people to invest in competing infrastructure, and they can still compete against Openreach given the price levels. Whereas in Area 3, in what they call the non-competitive areas, they will regulate so that it's only encouraging BT and Openreach to invest in those areas, and that will kind of indirectly, as a consequence, result in strong deterrence for investment by altnets like INCA members. Do the next slide, please. So just before I go into the response we've given, I'll just very briefly describe what Ofcom is proposing, particularly in Area 3, because that is the main concern that we have. They're proposing that they will regulate the Openreach wholesale broadband price down to a very low level, and then it will be possible for that price to be increased in accordance with how much money Openreach is spending on new fibre networks in those areas, in Area 3, as you just saw on the map. So it's kind of like a carrot and stick kind of remedy. So they are basically beating them first with the stick by saying your prices have to go all the way down. And then they're dangling the carrot in front of them saying, if you invest in fibre in these areas, we will allow you to put your prices back up again. And needless to say, if the prices are being driven down very aggressively in these areas, it's going to be even harder for INCA members to compete with Openreach and with the service providers that are using the Openreach network, because they will be able to offer better deals and better prices than you yourselves might be able to do. So that's kind of the core of our concern. So what we did was we drafted a response on behalf of INCA to the WFTMR, and these are the main points that we made. We believe that Ofcom has actually misdefined areas 2 and 3. Area 3 is full of locations where INCA members are investing in competitive networks, competing with Openreach. And Ofcom has ignored them, effectively thinking that they're not big enough. And that's where that critical word I mentioned before, material, comes in. They're looking at where there's material competition. And they kind of say that material competition is where it's sufficient competition to influence Openreach's behavior, and maybe change Openreach's way it does its prices, or the way it defines its services, or some other way. So we are criticizing them for not taking us into account and saying we are material, in particular, if you're looking at us as a cumulative effect across the INCA members rather than individual INCA members. We also criticize them the actual methodology. That's a little bit on a kind of a dry technical economic side, but they are not using good international practice, and they are inventing some rather strange ways of doing things. So we are highlighting that we don't believe that what they're doing is defensible within the rules that they should be following. Thirdly, we're saying that the incentives that I just described to you a minute ago, by which they reduce Openreach prices initially and then allow them to come back up again as they invest in fibre, they are not strong enough to actually make it viable or even interesting for BT Openreach to invest in Area 3, as opposed to the return that they would get if they invested the same amount of money in Area 2. Because in Area 2 is urban centres where they know that they are very likely to face competition. First mover advantage is very important in those areas, and BT Openreach are in a land grab a kind of fight with larger providers such as City Fibre and others to try and get as much deployment in urban areas as possible, to grab as many customers as they can. And so if you compare the benefits that Openreach would get from playing Ofcom's game and deploying fibre in Area 3 and being able to increase their prices there, is nowhere near as strong as the returns they would get if they just put all that money into Area 2 and competed head-on in places where they know that they are going to face competition in the relatively short term. Also, we have pointed out that, as most of you will be aware, that DCMS has a number of initiatives, including the Outside In initiative, where they are encouraging a multitude of individual small providers to bid for funding to deliver gigabit capable networks in hard to reach areas. It seems very odd that Ofcom's policy is directly disincentivizing small providers from building in these areas, and the DCMS policies is actively encouraging them to do so. And we're saying Ofcom needs to follow the government policy. Ofcom is the implementer of policy, not the maker of policy, and they need to follow that. Additionally, we have done quite a lot of work on Ofcom's cost modelling, and pointed out how they are assuming lower costs than actually are the case for altnets. And this goes to kind of how prices are set and the bands in which they are set within areas 2 and area 3, in particularly in area 2. And then there's some very important thing. It's only one point here, but it's very important. We've had a number of meetings with Ofcom, and we've asked them, why are you discriminating against altnets? Because that's what they're doing. In area 3, they're saying, we only want Openreach to invest. I mean, we don't mind if you invest, if you want to risk your money on it, but Openreach is who we want to invest here. That's very clear. That really comes out very strongly from the document and the consultation. I said, why are you doing that? And they're saying, we have a number of concerns. We have 3 main concerns with relying on altnets, because they're looking forward to the day when Openreach withdraws and retires its copper network, and fibre networks are the only networks in place. If Openreach does not deploy fibre networks everywhere, then they would be, Ofcom and consumers would be reliant entirely on the networks built by altnets. And the concerns that Ofcom has voiced to us is, can we be certain that altnets will actually provide ubiquitous coverage? Won't there be like, won't they just do a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit the other way? And if it's not ubiquitous, how can we reasonably expect that Openreach should fill in the gaps in the even less viable areas within Area 3? They're also concerned about, will consumers have the level of choice that they have today with Openreach networks? Because Openreach has an open access platform. It is a wholesale only provider. Anybody who wants to use the Openreach infrastructure can do so. You have competition by all the big national ISPs, as well as lots of small targeted or regional ISPs. Everybody can access that infrastructure, and the consumers benefit from the level of choice that they get there. Ofcom is very concerned whether there will be sufficient wholesale access to altnet networks so that consumers don't suffer if they rely entirely on an altnet network. And finally, they are concerned about whether or not altnets are sufficiently resilient as businesses, as provider of last resort. What would happen if a provider were to go out of business, to cease trading, and effectively stop operating its network? All the customers that are connected to that network would lose service. So they're three main concerns, and we've done quite a lot of work on that. We have, I think, strongly told them that in terms of ubiquity, altnets are just as good as Openreach in building out, and they will make use of the same government incentives that Openreach would make use of. There's absolutely no reason to suggest that altnets would do less hard to reach locations than Openreach would. In fact, many altnets are targeted specifically at reaching those types of locations and will therefore be better at it and probably do it quicker. In terms of wholesale, you may be aware that there is an initiative through INCA now to build a common altnet wholesale platform. That's going to be very critical. This is a very big concern for Ofcom, that we're building in the future proofing of consumer choice on altnet networks. In terms of providers of last resort, we believe that there are a number of things that Ofcom could do, initiatives they can take that are being taken in other utility type sectors to overcome that concern, but we haven't come up with any very specific concern kind of responses, and obviously we'll do what we can later on. And lastly, Ofcom also consulted on some very loose proposals on how BT could retire its copper network, but we did not respond to that at this time because we have responded to that previously. So if I go to the next slide. So the next steps for this is, it is clear we have an open door with Ofcom. We have dialogues going on with Ofcom. We need to keep speaking to Ofcom. It's really important that INCA and individual INCA members communicate to Ofcom. You know, if you want contact details, just let us know. We can put you in touch with people. We can set meetings up for you or participate in them with you to explain your businesses so that Ofcom understands it better. As I said, the development of the common altnet wholesale platform is absolutely critical. We need in the next 2, maximum 3 months to prove to Ofcom that this will happen. Otherwise, we don't think we can change their minds on what they're proposing to do in terms of regulation of Openreach and BT in Area 3, and that really is quite a big problem. If you can observe how you reach hard to reach areas and customers in hard to reach areas, again, that's really important. And if you have any ideas of initiatives to increase Ofcom's confidence in terms of provider last resort and service disruption. It's very quick overview this, but it is not an understatement that what Ofcom is proposing is an existential threat to some altnets, some INCA members. It's going to be very difficult to continue business if we don't persuade Ofcom to change what it's proposing. Okay, moving on to the DCMS, I've got 3 things to cover very quickly here. The DCMS has conducted a consultation on new build regulations. It closed that late last year and issued conclusions in March this year. And what it's doing is basically trying to, the whole purpose of that is to make sure that as many premises get gigabit capable connectivity as possible. And so they are basically, as you can see set out here, I won't read it out to you because we're going to give you the slides afterwards. But they're basically proposing to make sure that developers have an obligation to ensure that there is gigabit capable connectivity. So this is very, very important to yourselves. If you want to work with developers, it might be that they will be more receptive to work with you other than just working with Openreach as they may have done in the past. So they have existing powers that they will use as we just set out here. And then on the next slide, you'll see that they will also amend the building regulations to require that all new build developments have physical infrastructure to support gigabit capable connections. They'll amend the regulations to create requirement that housing developers will work with net operators to make sure that this happens. They will publish guidance, and they will continue to work with yourselves to make sure that that new housing developments are not kind of don't start out with substandard gigabit or broadband connectivity infrastructure that we can't do anything about. So that's a very good initiative. Additionally, I mentioned it earlier, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this. There is what's called the Outside In funding scheme that has been launched and much talked about in terms of Boris Johnson's initiative. Boris Johnson said that he would like to have gigabit capable connectivity to all premises by 2025. I think it's fair to say that most of us think that that is aspirational, but it's good that we have a political backing that really want to make this happen. So we are supporting it, just putting a few caveats around it. Up to £5 billion are available under this. Up to 5 million premises can be covered by it. The actual deployment time to spend the money is kind of around 9 to 12 years at the outside. Interestingly, here you can see, in order to qualify for participating in this, you must be able to prove that you will provide a functional wholesale access to the infrastructure that you build using these funds. And that feeds nicely into the initiative that INCA is running with the Common Alternate Wholesale Platform. And also, for once, the DCMS and Ofcom seem to be in sync and say that wholesale is very important. Bidding starts, qualification and bidding starts in January, and as far as I'm aware, the government is planning to start announce decisions around kind of towards the end of next year. So this is something to really keep an eye on. Now, last but not least, something called the Access to Infrastructure regulation. I don't know how many of you know about this, but it is actually really quite important. This was an EC directive called the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive. It was transposed into the UK legislation in 2016. And it basically says that telecoms providers can ask for and get access to other telecoms providers' networks and to non-telecoms networks. So that means that you could ask for access to each other's networks, and you can go to the water board or the rail company or the electricity company and say, we want access to your infrastructure. It doesn't mean that the non-telco providers can get access to yours, but it does mean you can get access to theirs. So this means that although in terms of regulation by Ofcom, only the BT Openreach infrastructure is open to access. Under the Access to Infrastructure regulation, all your networks are open to access, and people can demand access to them. Now, there are some reasons for why you can refuse supply or access, but they are vague, and as are the terms under which you have to offer supply in terms of costing and pricing. That's not, it just says it has to be fair and reasonable. DCMS have just launched a call for evidence and it closes on the 4th of September. They want to make the ATI more user-friendly. They want to use it more because it hasn't been used enough, they think. So they want to start thinking about, should we make more clarity about how the pricing should be set? Should we make the process clearer so people understand how to use it? Well, it's a complex regulation. There are lots and lots of issues in it. It's a double-edged sword, frankly, because it means you can access non-telecoms infrastructure, which is pretty non-contentious amongst you, I'm sure, but also you can access each other's infrastructure. So somebody can build a new piece of infrastructure today, and tomorrow somebody can knock on their door saying, I want access to that. And you need to have a good reason to say no. So this is very important. And so INCA will be doing a response. It's important that we try and get people to understand this and to work together on getting some sensible responses to this. One thing that's really interesting in that also, because I've had a number of conversations with DCMS about this, and that is that in discussing this, they have also said, well, there are a number of access provisions under the Electronic Communications Code that Tim just talked you through. We would like to informally invite comments on that as well to see whether we can strengthen any access provisions in there, so that if one telecom provider wants access to another telecoms provider's infrastructure or assets or equipment, then they can do so under the ECC. So again, they are pushing pretty heavily on opening up networks that may just have been built. The terms we need to, fight very strongly to make sure they are reasonable. This is not going to go away. We can possibly try and fight towards something near status quo, but I doubt it. I think it will get much, much clearer and easier to use. So what we need to do is make sure that the terms of doing so doesn't threaten the viability of your investments. And I think that's it. Yes.
Thank you.
Do you want to wind up, Tim?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
On time as well.
Yeah. Pretty good. And that was a very quick whistle top stop. And I'm sure what we were trying to demonstrate there is a lot of change that is about to happen. And some of that change is really going to impact your business. So you are definitely going to have to change your consumer terms and conditions. And you need to start thinking about that now. You're going to have to be increasing the amount of communication you have with your customers. And some of that communication is probably not what you'd want to send, or what your marketing manager might want to send, because it's sort of having to tell your customers, oh, you could be on a better package. Why don't you spend less money with us? So you need to be thinking about that. The changes that I was talking about to the Electronic Communications Code, the current bill that's going through, personally, my opinion is they're not necessarily going to help us with access to land that much, especially in city centres. And I know DCMS, as Geeta alluded to, are already thinking about what else could they do with the Electronic Communications Code to make it easier to use. As Geeta also said, the market review could literally be fatal to some of your business models if Ofcom don't change some of the things they're proposing. So it is absolutely critical you're involved in that debate. Geeta said the access to infrastructure regulations are a double-edged sword. It might make it easier for you to build your network in someone else's duct, but it'll also make it easier for others to build their network in your duct. And so how do you really want those to work? We've got a chance to influence DCMS on that at the moment. And there's a continual need just to stay abreast of the various DCMS initiatives that are ongoing. They're very active in this space, given the Prime Minister's targets that he set. And indeed, Ofcom doing an awful lot of work. And if you're like Community Fibre, we do not have a full-time regulatory person who can spend their full time working on this. I tend to do that in my spare time, if there is any. My main role is talking to landlords and trying to get them to sign way leaves with us. But I do the policy and regulatory bit in my spare time, and I'm sure, like many other operators on this call, you're not of a size that is sufficient to have a dedicated regulatory and policy person, and that is why the INCA the group is so important. And you can see all of the change that's coming, and the advantage of the INCA group is INCA can help us represent the views of the independent network operators into some of these consultations that are being run by DCMS and by Ofcom. And we don't have the time to do it ourselves, but joining the INCA group allows us to have a shared resource that can actually make sure our voice is heard, and some of these what could be disastrous changes don't actually go ahead. So really, what I'm just putting a call out to you, if you haven't done already, please do join the INCA Policy and Regulatory SIG, because it's only that way that our voice is going to be heard. All too often, Ofcom and DCMS just go and talk to Openreach and Virgin and believe that is all they need to speak to make their proposals and changes. And it's really important at this stage that INCA makes its voice heard, and that can only be done if you join the Policy and Regulatory SIG. So as I say, that was a very whistle-stop tour of what's going on at the moment. I'm sure you'll agree there is a lot going on. And we're now sort of open to questions, and I've seen Aidan, Paul has been putting some stuff up on the chat group, so thank you for that, Aidan. I think some of your points were you can structure an operator so that not all of those general conditions that I spoke about at the start apply, and Aidan pointed out that there have been companies that have structured themselves so that not all the general conditions apply to them, especially obviously some of the telephone services if you're not running a telephone service. I think the point is that there are certain provisions in there that do actually apply to all operators, and you certainly need to be aware of those. And so that, I guess, covers partly Aidan's point. Aidan also pointed out, in terms of, I was talking about the no network provision on how much a landlord can charge for an operator, and saying that they can only charge on the basis of the value of the land, not the basis of what the operator is going to be using the land for. And Aidan helpfully pointed out there was a case recently, a tribunal case between EE and the Islington Council, where effectively the space that EE wanted to use on their rooftop was ultimately valued at the charge of a parking space, or in fact a much reduced cost to that which Islington had been expecting to get for that rooftop space. And so these are some of the changes that have recently happened to the code that for mobile operators is significantly reducing the rents that they've traditionally had to pay for their rooftop space. Michael was asking, and Geeta, this may be one you can help me on. Ofcom was considering geographic de-averaging of Openreach pricing and having differential pricing depending on different parts of the country.
Yeah.
Has that got anywhere, and what's the latest on that? What's the latest thinking on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's effectively what the WFTMI is about. It's about saying there will be higher prices in urban areas and lower prices in rural areas. Like, you'd think logically it would be the other way around, because it's costs more money to serve people in rural areas because there's longer distances, fewer people. But they are effectively saying we'll set higher regulated wholesale prices for Openreach in urban areas, because that leaves what they call economic headroom to encourage investment by both Openreach and altnets. But in rural areas where they have decided they don't think altnets will invest quote unquote, materially, they will reduce the overreach prices, and therefore that will take away any headroom that may exist and actually make them lower than they are now and make it very difficult for alternatives to invest. So yes, so that is effectively what they're proposing under the WFTMR.
Thank you. Okay, so yes, that's definitely one to watch out for, because it could have serious consequences for some operators. Aidan, I'm pleased to see that you've successfully used the ATI regulations twice. You're the first person I've come across that has actually successfully used them, so congratulations to you. If there are others out there that have successfully used them, I think as part of DCMS's call for evidence, they're very keen to hear of those case studies. So again, either in your own right, please do respond to that call for evidence, but similarly, let's contribute to the INCA response so that we get a good evidence-based response back to them. Aidan, you're saying if Ofcom don't change their mind, then we'll have to probably go to appeal. I think that's absolutely right. Certainly, that may be the outcome of the market review if it goes badly.
And just on that, in that context, one of the reasons that some of the points we have covered in the response are quite technical in terms of whether Ofcom is following the international rules and is complying with the criteria that are set out. And we are in fact saying that Ofcom is in breach of its duties in terms of discrimination against alternatives in favor of Openreach. The reason we're doing that is in case we have to appeal, because in the law in the UK today, you cannot appeal the outcome of a decision. You can only appeal the process of getting there. So you can do judicial review, but you can't appeal on the merits, as it's called. So we have intentionally designed the response in such a way that it covers process points, that if in case there is the decision to appeal, we have those hooks there already.
And I think that's one of the things that as a group, INCA together is probably capable of doing, but individually, those are not necessarily points that we individually would have thought of. So it's very helpful to have someone like Geeta's input into those types of things. Ian, I think you were asking about the EECC regulations. And some of the stuff around the general conditions and whether they apply to all. I think what we said is some of those conditions will apply to all network operators and all service providers. Some of them only apply if you're providing different types of services. So for example, telephone service and the numbering conditions, telephone numbering conditions only apply if you're providing a telephone service. But I would encourage you. Yeah, go on. Sorry, Geeta.
So I just say some conditions are specifically triggered if you are selling services to domestic or SME customers. So if you're only serving the corporate market, certain consumer protection conditions don't apply.
That's right, and I think and yes, and there's some differences, as you say, between consumer and commercial market as well. So, but what I would encourage, as I said, I'll send around the links to the various documents. I would encourage that you familiarise yourselves with the general conditions, because as you saw at the start, if you get it wrong, you can you can fall foul of the regulator, and they can fine you a considerable amount of money if you get it wrong. Okay. They then had a question just about the access to infrastructure regulations. It says, is engagement for this tit for tat? If I ask for access via you, does that mean you have to reciprocate? From what I've read of the regulations, the agreement itself you put in place doesn't have to be reciprocal, but it does require both parties if I request one party to access their infrastructure, there's nothing to prevent that party asking me to access for access to my infrastructure, and there's only very small number of reasons I can give for refusing access. I think that's right, Geeta.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's right. It's not tit for tat. It's a one-way street, as it were. You ask for access, and you either get it or you don't. It might be that two parties each ask each other, but there is no there's no kind of reciprocity involved in it at all. So you can go and ask somebody for access to their network, and it may be that if they then ask for access to yours, you'd say no because I qualify under one of the reasons for refusal. It's very loose, it's quite vague, which is good and bad, but the profile of it and the usability of it and the clarity of it will be improved substantially, I think, over the next 6 to 9 months or something like that. And I think it's important that that's understood.
Excellent. Good. And Aidan was just making the point that the exception to the merits point is whether the result actually complied with the law. That is not discretionary. I think that was in relation to ATI and repeats what Geeta was just saying.
I think it was in relation to the what you can appeal on.
Oh,
if you can
okay.
appeal an Ofcom decision.
Yeah.
Whether it's judicial review or merits. You're right, Aidan. Yes.
Okay. I think that covers off most of the questions we've got in the chat now. If there are any other questions, please do just post those now. If you've got any other thoughts or questions on what you've heard today, then happy to have those. But if we don't get any more within the next few minutes, then I think that's all we were planning to cover off today. Geeta, I don't know if there's any other final thoughts that you wanted to add.
No, only that if you have questions, let us know. I don't mean specific questions now, but it may be that you need your board to understand it or something like that, and we can arrange to do a brief presentation to your board or something. If these points really are quite significant for most of you, and they can seem a bit obscure, and they are quite often in a language that's not that easy to penetrate in terms of really understanding the impact on your businesses. But take our word for it, the impact is big. So think about it and do something, and reach out if you need help.
Thank you so much, Geeta. And Mark, were you going to say something?
I was. Thank you. It's Mark from G Network. First of all, thanks you both for the last hour and a quarter. It's been incredibly helpful and informative, so really appreciate it. I had a specific question about the regulation around providing gigabit connectivity into new build services. Are you aware of anything that DCMS is doing to encourage house builders to look around the connectivity market? Because there's a risk that otherwise they'll just plump for OpenReach or potentially Virgin Media as a default, which obviously damages all of our businesses potentially.
So Mark, it's certainly in the London space, there has been discussion, I don't know if you've been involved, with the GLA, Connected Digital Connection team, and they have been looking to include something within the London plan that sort of encourages developers to look at more than just one operator. I think that's as far as they'd got in their discussions. I think you raise a valid point, and what I think the position, and Geeta may be able to correct me here, I think the position is DCMS has made a public announcement that they're going to look at the rules and the legislation again. They haven't actually done it, so now is probably the opportunity to make those points to them. Geeta, I don't know if there's anything else you can add.
No, I agree with you. I mean, what we have to remember is that, much as we feel that we are disadvantaged compared to Openreach and Virgin Media, it isn't within the gift of either Ofcom or the government to tell local authorities who to do business with. And they have equal right, and the fact that they're convenient and in many places means that they have a significant, competitive advantage. And I think facilitation is the only thing government can really do.
Yes, agreed. But I know the GLA certainly were looking at trying to put some stuff in place where they had to at least speak to more than just one operator to get some options, and I think that's probably as far as they can go in that space.
Thanks, both.
Excellent. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, you'll have noticed just that it did actually say in the bullet points that were up that if they're speaking to one provider that can't deliver within the budget, they have to then go and look for another one and see if somebody else could do it.
Yeah. Was it that slide or was it the previous one?
No, it's a previous one, I think. Yeah, the penultimate bullet. Developers must seek a second quote from network operators where the first quote suggests that gigabit-capable broadband cannot be installed within the cost cap. So at least, I mean, they're saying there that you can't take the easy way out, that one party says, no, it's too expensive, and therefore we just leave it.
But these are all proposals at the moment. So as I say, now is the time. And INCA has good contacts into DCMS, and there's an open dialogue on some of these points. So again, if you can join up with the SIG, then we can work our way through that. Good. All right. Well, look, it just leaves me to say thank you all for your time and attention this afternoon. I appreciate it. Some of these topics can feel a little dry and a little dull, but as Geeta has emphasised, they could have a huge impact on your business. So it is worth trying to stay abreast of them. We will, with the help of Jill and Graham, be making these slides available. I will add a couple of links to them just before Graham puts them up, so you actually have links to some of the detail that sits behind the summaries we've provided today. But as I say, thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Yeah, bye everyone.
Thank you, Tim.
No problem. We got. I don't know if Lloyd managed to get on the chat window. He was struggling at one point, I think.
Yeah, I think he did. Hold on, he's still on, I think.
All right. Oh, he's just said no. Oh, he's putting stuff on the chat window, but perhaps he can't see it. I can see your comments, Lloyd. Thank you very much.
And Lloyd, I've also put you onto the panel so you can speak to Tim, and
that's it. Good.
Bear with me 1 second. Just take.
That's my fault. Sorry. Hi, Tim. Well done. Right. That was excellent.
Good. Yeah. No, it's always difficult to make quite such a dry topic.
No, it was excellent. Really good. What I was trying to say was I could talk to the panel, and when you emailed back, I could see, or you chatted back, but I couldn't see what other people were chatting to the panel. So it was just the way it's set up. So I thought we'd see the list of people talking, what they were asking. But I couldn't see that. I could only see what you wrote and what I wrote to you.
I see.
Does that make sense?
It depends what they select at the time, Lloyd. You can either talk to the panelists only or panelists and attendees.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And most people,
not a problem. I mean, I didn't know whether you thought people could see everything, and that was all. I only said it for that reason.
To be fair, I assumed that people could see
Setting us back up and copying and pasting anything into their panelist only.
Yeah.
And I don't think you missed any of the questions, Tim, at all.
No, I think I got them all. I think I
Yeah.
got them all. Good.
Well done.
Did you manage to have, while I've got you on the line, did you manage to have your catch up yesterday or on
No,
call?
well, we had a bit of a catch up. Will you be on tomorrow's discussion? I'm trying to
Have we got one now?
8:31 tomorrow, or
Let me just have a look at my
may not
diary.
be the.
What I don't know if I've got a pretty busy day
That
tomorrow.
one was tomorrow morning was policy and governance. Sorry, funding and governance.
No, so I'm not on
just
that.
internal. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I thought Tim that the meeting that we had with DCMS was really quite positive.
Yeah.
I was quite encouraged by their commentary, and it's very clear that he gets it.
Yeah. He does. He does absolutely get it.
Yeah, and what was lovely was, I don't know if you noticed, but he started to adopt some of the isms that we were using. So the word common wholesale platform is quite a new introduction of a phrase, and he was already using it by the end of the conversation.
Yeah. So I think they're supportive, and I sent you a note and we hadn't managed to catch up. Certainly from Graham's perspective, his question is, are Sky and TalkTalk and Vodafone going to use this?
I think I have to be honest.
Excuse me, guys.
Yeah,
I promoted you to co-host, both of you. So when I end this, you shouldn't get interrupted. If you do, one of you give me a call on my mobile and I'll come straight back on.
That's fine. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm just going to stop the recording as well.
Oh, yes. Good point.
Yeah.